I want you to think about the phenomenological experience of sitting in the eye doctor's chair. You know the exact setup.
Oh, yeah. You're in that dimly lit room. Your chin is resting on that little plastic guard.
Exactly. And the optometrist pulls down that massive, intimidating metal apparatus. I think it's called the phoropter.
Yeah, the phoropter. It looks like a medieval torture device.
Right. So they start clicking lenses into place, flipping them back and forth, and they ask you that incredibly binary question, better one or better two.
Right, right.
And the entire medical practice, and really, I mean, our entire conscious experience is built on a very specific, totally unquestioned architectural assumption about reality happening in that room.
Yeah, it's an assumption we literally never think about.
Exactly. The assumption is that there is a defined objective you sitting in the chair, like a stable subject. And that subject possesses an instrument, which is your faculty of sight. And you are utilizing that instrument to look across the room at an entirely separate objective reality. The eye chart with the big letter E on it.
Right. Subject, instrument, object.
Yes. Subject, instrument, object. It just feels so undeniable.
It feels undeniable because it's the bedrock of our existence, really. I mean, it's the only way our language and, frankly, our biological survival mechanisms know how to operate.
Well, yeah, you have to know a tiger is separate from you to run away from it.
Right, exactly. We navigate our entire lives on the premise of subject-object dualism. We are an independent self, gazing out at an independent world through the distinct, measurable action of perceiving.
Right.
But if you dive into the nuances of second-century Indian philosophy, and specifically the Mūlamadhyamakakārikā, or the MMK for short.
Written by Nāgārjuna.
Yeah, written by Nāgārjuna. If you look at that entire structured environment of the optometrist's office completely unravels, like it just falls apart.
It really does. And reading through the translations of Chapter 3 by scholars like J. Garfield and Stephen Batchelor, you realize Nāgārjuna isn't just offering some slight cognitive reframe here.
No, not at all. He is systematically dismantling the ontological machinery of how experience itself is generated.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because if you are listening to us right now, you inherently feel like a permanent observer. I mean, we all do.
Right. You feel like a self looking at a dashboard of sensory data.
Exactly. You feel the act of hearing our voices, and you perceive the object of the audio playing from your phone or whatever. And in Chapter 3, Nāgārjuna isolates this exact triad.
The union of the three spheres of perception.
Right. You have the perceiver, which is the subject or the sense faculty. You have the perception, which is the cognitive action or relation. And you have the perceived, the object, the world itself.
We treat those as three solid, independent building blocks that just happen to interact in space.
Yeah, like Legos snapping together.
Yeah.
But Nāgārjuna's argument is that before we can truly understand what perception is, we have to endure the cognitive dissonance of understanding what it logically cannot be.
Right. And to do that, he uses Madhyamaka reasoning, which relies really heavily on a dialectical tool called the tetralemma.
The four-cornered logic.
Exactly. Nāgārjuna's ultimate goal in Chapter 3 is to demonstrate that not a single one of those three spheres possesses svabhāva.
And svabhāva translates to, inherent independent essence.
Yeah, independent essence. He forces us into a corner where we basically have to admit that none of these components exist absolutely on their own, and he doesn't just ask us to take his word for it.
No, he's rigorous.
Very rigorous. He tests the mechanics of how an independent perceiver could possibly interact with an independent perceived object.
Well, I want to challenge the premise immediately, actually, because for an audience accustomed to Western empirical science, this can sound like just philosophical wordplay that ignores physical reality.
Sure, I can see that.
Let's look at a real-world analogy. Think about a security camera bolted to the side of a brick building. The camera is the perceiver, right?
Okay, following you.
Its existence is not up for debate when you can touch it. It's made of plastic, glass, and wiring. The recording process, the data moving through the fiber optic cables, is the action, the perception.
Right.
And the parking lot it's filming is the perceived world. The parking lot is just sitting there objectively, bathed in photons, whether the camera is plugged in or not.
It's just concrete and painted lines.
Exactly. It is a strictly mechanical transfer of data from an inherently existing outside world into an inherently existing receiving instrument. So how on earth does Nāgārjuna justify arguing that those aren't three separate, independently existing entities?
Well, that security camera is the ultimate representation of common sense realism, and it is exactly the framework Nāgārjuna targets.
Oh, really? He goes right for the camera. Well, the ancient equivalent, I guess.
Yeah. He begins his refutation by attacking the core requirement of inherent existence, which is self-sufficiency. Nāgārjuna argues that if a faculty of sight, whether it's a silicon camera sensor or the human optic nerve, has an independent inherent essence of seeing, it must logically be able to apply that essence to itself.
Wait, meaning it should be able to perceive its own nature.
Exactly. But the crux of the argument in Chapter 3 is a seemingly simple paradox. Sight does not see itself.
Oh, I see. A camera lens cannot film the camera lens.
Right. And the human eye cannot turn around and look at the optic nerve.
Okay, but does it need to? I mean, a toaster doesn't toast itself, but it still exists.
That's a good point, but the historical context here is crucial. During Nāgārjuna's time, rival philosophical schools, particularly the Nyāya school, defended the inherent existence of perception using the fire analogy.
The fire analogy, how did that work?
They argued that perception was like a flame. A candle flame illuminates the darkness and reveals the objects in a room, right? But crucially, it also illuminates itself.
Oh, interesting. Because you don't need a second flashlight to see a burning candle.
Exactly. Therefore, these Nyāya scholars argued the faculty of sight can see other things while simultaneously validating its own inherent existence. It illuminates the world and itself at the exact same time.
Which, on the surface, feels like a structurally sound defense. I mean, the instrument performs its function and proves its existence in the same action?
It sounds great until you look closer. Nāgārjuna dismantles the fire analogy with ruthless precision. He points out a flaw in the physics of their metaphor. Fire doesn't actually burn or illuminate itself in the way they claim.
How so?
If fire could apply its action to its own essence, it would consume itself instantaneously. And action requires a differential between the actor and the recipient of the action.
Oh, wow. So you need distance. You need a subject and an object for an action to occur.
Precisely. Furthermore, even if we entertain the flawed fire metaphor, the biological reality of sight remains unchanged. Sight unequivocally does not see itself.
Right, the eye cannot see the eye.
And Nāgārjuna's logical leap from this is profound. He states that if the sense of sight cannot establish its own reality by perceiving its own nature, it is logically impossible for it to possess a standalone, inherent power to see other things.
Wait, run that by me again.
If your security camera lacks an independent essence of seeing that it can apply to its own hardware, it cannot possibly bring an independent essence of seeing to the parking lot. An entity that requires external conditions to define its core function is, by definition, empty of inherent essence.
Wow. It forces a complete ontological vertigo, honestly. If I can't establish the I independently, the entire subjective anchor point of my reality dissolves.
It pulls the rug right out from under you.
So we are left with this triad, right? The camera, the recording, the parking lot, none of which have inherent existence. But they still seem to interact. I mean, I have the video file to prove it.
Right. The conventional reality is still happening.
So this is where Nāgārjuna applies the tetralemma to test the spatial and logical relationships between the perceiver and the perceived, right?
Yes. He applies the tetralemma to exhaust literally every conceptual possibility we might use to cling to their inherent existence. Let's walk through the 4 logical propositions.
Okay, let's do it.
Proposition 1. Are the perceiver and the perceived identical? Are they one and the same entity?
Well, clearly not.
No.
If the observer and the observed were identical, the entire distinction of perception would collapse.
How so?
Like, if I am drinking a cup of coffee and I am identical to the object of my perception, then I am the coffee cup. The camera is the concrete in the parking lot. There would be no distance across which perception could occur. So, identity is definitively out.
Exactly. Which brings us to proposition 2. And this is where the vast majority of human beings, and your security camera analogy, comfortably live.
Okay, what is it?
Are the perceiver and the perceived completely different and separate? Do they exist as fundamentally independent entities that merely bump into each other?
Well, yeah, they have to be. I mean, the camera's bolted to the wall, the parking lot is 50 feet away, they occupy different coordinates in space and time.
But here is where Nāgārjuna's logic acts as a vice. He argues that if the observer and the observed were truly inherently separate, meaning they possessed absolute independent closed-loop essences, they could never interact to produce an experience of perception.
Because they're completely sealed off from each other.
Exactly. An independent entity, by strict philosophical definition, does not rely on, react to, or interact with anything outside of itself. If it did, its state would be contingent on that external thing, stripping it of its independence.
Oh, I see. If the camera is an entirely separate, inherently existing perceiver, there is an unbridgeable metaphysical void between it and the parking lot.
Right. The moment the camera receives photons bouncing off the asphalt, the camera's state is altered. Its function as a perceiver is now entirely dependent on the presence of the parking lot. It is no longer an independent, separate entity. It is a contingent entity.
The very act of interacting destroys their independence. That is wild. If I define myself as an entirely separate observer sitting behind my eyes, I basically lock myself in an airtight box. The second I experience the outside world, my internal state, my neurochemistry, my mood, my visual cortex, is altered by that world.
You are reacting. You are contingent.
I am relying on the world to be an observer.
Yeah.
So, Proposition 2 fails. They cannot be inherently separate.
Which leads to Proposition 3. Are they both identical and different at the same time?
Well, that just violates basic logic. It's a complete contradiction. You can't be completely the same thing and completely separate things simultaneously. That's nonsense.
Which leaves Proposition 4. Are they neither identical nor different?
If we say they are neither, we're essentially denying that perception occurs at all. We are saying the entire phenomenon is a non-starter.
Right. It leads to absolute nihilism.
But that contradicts our lived experience. I am seeing the coffee cup. The camera is generating an MP4 file of the parking lot. The conventional experience is undeniably happening.
So we arrive at the culmination of the spatial reasoning. The perceiver, the perception, and the perceived are not identical. Not different, not both, and not neither.
Which covers literally every base.
Every single spatial base. And just to seal off any escape routes, Nāgārjuna applies a temporal refutation as well.
Oh, he brings time into it.
Yeah, he asks us to locate the inherent action of perception in time. Is the perception located in the past? Well, no, because the act is already complete. The perceived has already been perceived.
Right.
Is it in the future? No, the interaction hasn't initiated yet.
So the natural response is that perception exists purely in the present. It's happening right now in this exact millisecond.
But isolate that present moment. If you try to freeze time to locate the independent, inherent action of seeing, what happens?
I guess it stops.
Exactly. A frozen, independent present moment has no duration, no movement, and therefore no action. The present is instantly sliding from the future into the past. You cannot pin down an isolated present perception that exists independently of the flow of time.
So spatial logic proves they aren't separate. Identical, both, or neither. Temporal logic proves the action can't be isolated in the past, present, or future.
He traps you completely.
He really does. And if you are listening to this, you are probably feeling exactly what early readers of the MMK felt. A sense of absolute nihilistic dread.
Yeah, it feels like he just deleted reality.
Right. Because if the perceiver, the act, and the object lack any inherent reality and can't be pinned down anywhere in space or time, how does anything happen?
Yeah.
We know we're having a conversation. We know you were listening to an audio file right now.
The world is still turning.
So if the universe isn't a collection of independent objects interacting, what is it?
Well, the universe isn't deleted by Nāgārjuna's logic. It is liberated from our rigid categorizations. Because these spheres lack independent inherent existence, they are entirely free to exist relationally.
Okay, relationally.
Yes. This is the pivot from deconstruction to the constructive core of Madhyamaka, which is dependent origination. Consciousness doesn't exist as a spark inside a vacuum. It arises only in dependence. The three spheres of perception are co-defined and co-evolving.
I love that. And the translations by Garfield and Batchelor highlight a brilliant grounding analogy for this. The relationship between a parent and a child.
That's a great one.
Right. A child is only defined as a child in strict dependence on the existence of a mother and father.
Right.
Conversely, an adult is only a mother or father in dependence on the existence of the child.
Right. You cannot possess the inherent identity of a parent floating in a void.
Exactly. The identity is entirely co-created by the relationship. And applying that to Chapter 3, consciousness only emerges in dependence on a sense organ and a corresponding object. You cannot have a perceiver waiting off stage.
The act of perceiving a visual form is precisely what gives birth to the perceiver. The act gives birth to the actor. What's fascinating here is the cognitive shift this requires. It is massive. We have to completely abandon the search for an origin point.
No Big Bang of consciousness.
Exactly. The text describes this as a limitless and centerless fractal cycle. There is no first perceiver who blinked their eyes and kicked off the universe, and there is no final objective world waiting to be discovered at the end of scientific inquiry.
It is a continuous, sedulous loop of co-arising conditions.
Perfectly said.
Well, I want to ground this centralist loop in the moment-to-moment reality of the listener, because the commentaries on the MMK dive deeply into the mechanics of karmic updating.
Oh yes, the micro-level stuff.
Right. It is not just a passive realization that the observer and the observed arise together. It's a highly volatile, active process where they are constantly transforming each other at the microsecond level.
Let's slow down a single fraction of a second of human experience to look at that. The perceiver encounters the perceived. But the perceiver in this equation is not a pristine blank slate.
I'd bring our baggage.
So much baggage. The perceiver is an accumulation of conditions heavily influenced by past karma. And in this context, karma doesn't mean cosmic justice.
Like you do something bad and get struck by lightning.
Right, it's not that. It means the accumulated momentum of past actions, deep-seated psychological habits, biological wiring, memories. This incredibly dense conditioned state acts as the very lens through which the world is generated.
Think about how you, the listener, perceive a dog walking toward you on the sidewalk. Let's say if you were viciously bitten by a dog as a child. Your nervous system, your amygdala, your conditioned karma has shaped your perceiver state, right?
Heavily shaped it.
So when you look at the golden retriever, the perceived world that physically arises for you is one of genuine physiological threat. The dog is a monster, your heart rate spikes, your palms sweat.
It is functionally a dangerous beast in your reality.
Right. But if the person walking next to you grew up breeding golden retriever puppies, their perceiver state is entirely different. They look at the exact same arrangement of atoms, the exact same photons hitting their retina, and the perceived world that arises for them is one of joy and safety. Their biology relaxes.
They want to pet it.
Exactly. Your past conditioning literally co-creates the dog you are perceiving in that moment. The dog is not an objective, fixed entity broadcasting a single universal reality. The dog is an object, and you as the subject are co-arising based on historical conditions.
That illustrates the cycle of karmic updating perfectly. The interaction, the perception, creates a physiological and psychological reaction, which instantaneously updates the perceiver's state.
Because you felt fear, you are now a slightly different new perceiver than you were a second ago.
Exactly. And because your internal state has updated, you now look back out at a slightly new perceived world. Let's say the dog barks, which to you confirms the threat, spinning the cycle further.
It's a feedback loop.
A total feedback loop. There is no solid, unchanging self weathering this storm of sensory input. The self and the world are a fluid, dreamlike interplay. They function together as a single, breathing organism of dependent origination.
It really feels like looking in a mirror that's reflecting another mirror.
It really is. Every time you zoom in on the self, you only find the internalized reflections of the world. Every time you zoom in on the world, you only find the projected conditioning of the self.
Which brings us to the ultimate philosophical reckoning of this deep dive. If the self and the world are co-evolving karmic mirages, how do we define what is actually real?
It's the million-dollar question.
The human mind demands a categorization. If we fully accept the union of the three spheres, we have to endure a systematic dismantling of every philosophical behagism we've ever constructed to feel safe.
This raises an important question, right? Nāgārjuna anticipates the human mind's desperation to find a conceptual lifeboat. When you take away the solid world, the mind scrambles for an alternative absolute.
We want something to hold on to.
We desperately need a floor to stand on. To prevent this, Nāgārjuna runs through the generalization of the tetralemma. He systematically destroys all conceptual attempts to pin reality down, explicitly defining what reality is not.
Okay, let's run through them.
First, based on everything we've just discussed, reality is not purely objective. We can discard realism entirely. There is no observer-independent reality out there waiting to be measured.
The parking lot does not exist in an absolute finalized state independent of a perceiver.
Correct.
And inevitably, the listener's immediate reflex is to swing the pendulum to the absolute opposite extreme. Like, okay, if the objective world isn't real and the dog is just a co-creation of my biological karma, then it's all just in my head.
Right, subjective idealism.
Yeah, Nāgārjuna is pitching subjective idealism or solipsism. I am the only thing that actually exists, and this entire universe is just a simulation or a dream generated by my mind.
It is easily the most common misinterpretation of emptiness. But Nāgārjuna shoots down idealism and solipsism just as quickly as realism. Reality is not purely subjective.
Why not? If there's no objective world, doesn't it have to be subjective?
Your theory that it's all in your head fails because there is no permanent you to possess the head.
Oh, right. We already proved the perceiver doesn't exist independently either.
Exactly. There is no permanent self, no independent consciousness residing outside the process of perception. Without the external world to act as a catalyst for perception, the perceiver vanishes. You cannot be a lonely solipsistic God dreaming up the universe because a dreamer fundamentally requires a dream in order to exist as a dreamer.
Okay, so it's not an objective world, and it's not a subjective dream. What about process philosophy? What if the camera and the parking lot aren't real, but the data transfer, the relation itself, is the fundamental reality? Reality is purely relational.
Nāgārjuna rejects that too. A relation cannot possess inherent existence if the entities it is relating are empty.
Like a bridge to nowhere.
Exactly. You cannot have a bridge suspended over a canyon if the cliffs on either side don't inherently exist. The process lacks inherent essence without the relata.
So we combine them. Dualism. Or pluralism. It's a synergistic combination of the perceiver, the perceived, and the process all coming together to make reality.
A combination of empty components does not spontaneously generate inherent reality. 0 plus 0 plus 0 still equals 0 inherent essence.
Right.
Neither the subject nor the object brings a permanent, independent reality to the meeting, so their combination cannot result in an absolute reality.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this is where the spiritual New Age lifeboat usually deploys.
Oh, I know exactly what you're going to say.
If reality isn't separate, if it's not subjective and it's not a dualistic combination, then it must be one.
Yeah.
Monism. We are all just drops of water in a giant featureless cosmic soup. The boundaries between you and me are fake, and reality is just a massive radial oneness.
I am so glad you brought that up because it's a vital distinction. Nāgārjuna explicitly denies monism. Reality is not a giant featureless oneness.
It's not, but everyone says we are all one when they talk about Eastern philosophy.
It's a huge misconception. If you think about it biologically and practically, if monism were true, if there were absolutely no distinction between the subject and the object, the biological mechanism of perception would completely shut down.
Explain that.
If you and the dog are literally the exact same undifferentiated cosmic soup, a dog bite cannot occur. Teeth cannot pierce skin if there is no boundary between teeth and skin. Perception requires the dynamic play of difference.
Oh, wow. So you need conventional boundaries for things to happen.
Exactly. Emptiness does not mean everything melts into a gray void. It means that the highly vivid, highly differentiated things we experience are empty of independent essence.
So if reality is not objective, not subjective, not the relation, not a combination, and absolutely not a cosmic oneness, what are we left with? I feel like we have exhausted the entire menu of human philosophy.
We have, and we're left with the profound elegance of the union of the two truths. This is the ultimate synthesis of Madhyamaka.
Two truths.
There is the conventional truth, and there is the ultimate truth. Conventionally, things absolutely appear, function, and have consequences. You still stop at red lights, the dog bite still bleeds, you still have to pay your taxes.
Unfortunately.
Right. These phenomena are there and operate according to cause and effect, but ultimately they are entirely empty of inherent independent essence. The commentaries often use the analogy of an echo.
Echo in a canyon.
Yeah. An echo is undeniably something you can hear. It functions, it scares the birds, it has a cause. But if you try to walk into the canyon and physically grab the echo itself, you will find nothing but empty space. It is vividly present, yet lacks any core substance. It is there, yet not there.
There, yet not there. It's a reality that completely breaks our dualistic language. I mean, our grammar requires subjects and objects. I see the tree. When the universe doesn't operate with inherent subjects and objects, our language literally fails to describe it. We can only point toward it using analogies like the echo.
Exactly. Language is a conventional tool, so it struggles with ultimate reality.
But I want to pull this soaring philosophy back down to the pavement. It's exhilarating to stare into the indescribable reality of the two truths during a late-night debate with friends. But eventually, the alarm clock goes off on Monday morning.
The conventional world demands your attention.
Right. We have to go to work, deal with difficult people, manage our finances. What does Chapter 3 of the MMK mean for our actual daily human suffering? How does realizing the emptiness of the perceiver and the perceived help us navigate a traffic jam?
This is exactly where Nāgārjuna transitions from being a rigorous logician to a profoundly liberating psychologist.
Oh, really? It becomes practical.
Extremely practical.
Yeah.
The realization of emptiness has immediate, massive practical consequences. The primary application is the dissolution of the observer-observed divide, which is basically the root cause of almost all our daily psychological suffering.
Okay, walk me through that.
Think about the architecture of your anxiety. It almost always stems from the illusion that you are an isolated, fragile I, trapped behind your eyes, fighting against an external, inherently real world that is happening to you.
Oh, absolutely. The world is throwing bad bosses, medical bills, and traffic at me. I am besieged.
It's the ultimate defensive posture. Me versus the universe.
Right, we're constantly bracing for impact.
But if you internalize the primordial interconnectedness we've been discussing, if you realize that the perceiver, the perception, and the perceived are a single co-arising dance, that boundary dissolves. You are not a separate observer being assaulted by an external world. You are a localized expression of the universe experiencing itself.
That's a huge shift in perspective.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the profound psychological relief comes when you ask, if the world is a karmic mirage, an echo that is there yet not there, why am I engaging with it with such desperate white-knuckled attachment and aversion?
I have an analogy for how this functions practically, but I want you to pressure test it against the MNK.
Sure, lay it on me.
I often think of navigating the conventional truth, like playing an incredibly immersive punching video game, like Elden Ring or something where you die a lot.
Good game, very stressful.
Right. When you are playing, you are fully engaged. You strategize, you dodge attacks, you use the tools the game provides to survive. That's the conventional truth. You have to play by the rules of the game to progress. But deep down, no matter how intense the boss fight gets, you never forget you are playing a game. You know the dragon breathing fire on your screen isn't made of actual biological scales and heat. It's an illusion made of code and pixels.
Right, you aren't actually going to burn.
Because you understand its ultimate emptiness, you don't suffer genuine existential trauma when your character dies. You act without acting. You function skillfully in the simulation, but you are liberated from taking it as an absolute reality.
I like the video game analogy because it captures the idea of skillful engagement without existential grasping. However, from a strict Madhyamaka perspective, we have to be very careful with it.
So does it break down?
A little bit. In Elden Ring, the dragon is an illusion, yes, but it is built on a base reality of code, servers, and hardware sitting in a data center somewhere.
Right.
The danger of the simulation analogy is that it implies there is a hidden base reality running the universe behind the scenes.
Like the Matrix.
Exactly. Nāgārjuna is far more radical than the Matrix. He is saying there is no code. There is no base layer of pixels. There is no server running the simulation. It is empty all the way down. The emptiness itself is the reality.
That is a crucial distinction. There is no real world hiding behind the illusion. The interdependent illusion is all there is.
Exactly. So liberation isn't about unplugging from the matrix to find the real world. Liberation is achieved right here in the middle of the traffic jam by changing our relationship to the phenomena.
We navigate our career and finances skillfully, but we stop reifying them. We stop treating a failure at work as an indelible stain on our permanent inherent self, because neither the failure nor the self has inherent existence. They are just a fleeting convergence of conditions.
Exactly. And this leads to the most vital and often misunderstood consequence of Chapter 3, boundless compassion.
Compassion. How do we get from emptiness to compassion? Emptiness can sound incredibly cold and detached.
When misunderstood, yes, it sounds like nihilistic detachment. But logically, it is the exact opposite. If there is no separate, inherently existing I, then logically and ontologically, there is no separate, inherently existing other.
The boundary is gone.
The boundaries between you and the person suffering next to you are merely conventional designations. They are not absolute metaphysical walls.
So compassion isn't just a nice ethical guideline or like a moral imperative handed down by a deity.
No, it is the mechanical ontological truth of the union of the three spheres. When you perceive someone in pain, the perceiver you and the perceived the person in pain are co-arising in that exact moment. You share the identical interdependent web.
So you are basically feeling yourself.
Therefore, compassionate action isn't a chore or an ethical debate. It is the spontaneous, natural result of recognizing emptiness. Think of your own body. When your left hand accidentally touches a hot stove, your right hand doesn't pause to debate the moral ethics of assisting the left hand.
It doesn't weigh the pros and cons.
The right hand doesn't say, well, that's the left hand's karma, it's not my problem. It inherently feels the interconnectedness of the single organism, and it acts instantly to pull the left hand away.
The suffering of the world is quite literally your own suffering, because the boundary defining you and the world is an illusion.
Exactly. That is the true heart of Madhyamaka.
I want to bring this directly to you, the listener, as we try to wrap our arms around the sheer magnitude of what we've covered today. Think about the biggest stressor in your life right now. You know, the thing that is keeping you awake at 3 a.m.
We all have one.
Are you treating it as an objective monster? Are you viewing it as a solid, inherently real entity that is attacking your equally solid, inherently real self?
Chances are, yes.
What happens if you apply Madhyamaka reasoning to it? Can you begin to see that stressor as a co-created mirage, a temporary, fleeting alignment of causes and conditions, deeply shaped by your own biological and psychological karma, arising together like an echo in a canyon?
Yes, it is conventionally there and you have to navigate it. But it does not possess the ultimate power to define you because neither you nor the stressor has an independent essence.
We started this deep dive sitting in the eye doctor's chair, trapped in the assumption that we are a permanent self using an instrument to look at an objective world. Nāgārjuna completely shatters that chair.
He really does.
He proves that the perceiver, the perception, and the perceived world are an inseparable triad. They cannot exist without each other. There is no permanent self. There is no independent objective reality. We are participating in an endless, centerless, fractal cycle of dependent origination.
And by resting in that realization, we avoid the traps of nihilism and idealism. We find the middle way. We realize that reality defies our clumsy language. It is a luminous, interdependent dance that we can engage with joyfully, compassionately, and completely free from the paralyzing grip of grasping.
It's beautiful, really.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, drawing from the ultimate implications of the text. We've spent a lot of time deconstructing reality, but the commentaries point toward a profound state of being called tathata in Sanskrit.
Tathata, what does that translate to?
It translates roughly to suchness.
Suchness, I love that word.
Consider this. What if the highest state of human existence isn't figuring out the universe? What if it isn't about finally pinning reality down with the perfect scientific theory or the ultimate philosophical argument?
What if we stop trying to solve the puzzle?
Exactly. What if the highest state is simply resting in the suchness of reality? Tomorrow, when you wake up and look at a tree outside your window, or you look at a loved one across the breakfast table, or you open that frustrating email at work, try to perceive them without being the perceiver.
Wow. Dropping the role entirely.
Try to drop the heavy, exhausting narrative of the solid I who is separate from the experience. Let the tree just be the treeing. Let the loving just be the loving. Try to experience the world not as a series of hostile events happening to you, but as a dynamic, limitless dance happening with you.
Happening with you. The next time you sit in that optometrist chair and they pull the phoropter down and ask, better one or better two, maybe you can just smile. Because you'll know that the eye, the chart on the wall, and the light vibrating between them are all the exact same beautiful, empty illusion. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it shifted your perspective even just a little bit and provided a new lens through which to view your reality. Until next time, take care and keep questioning how you see the world.